I was very confused as a teenager. The fact that I loved to please others didn't help much either, since it caused me to act one way in one situation and in a different way in others. I basically acted and put on whatever mask was required of me to get the best grades, to form the right impressions, and to fit into all the desirable groups. I did whatever I had to do in order to be accepted and get ahead. So to my parents, I was an honors student, a violin virtuoso, a hockey player, a black belt in Taekwondo, and a future Harvard Medical School neurosurgeon who was going to complete his fellowship at Johns Hopkins. To my friends at school, I was quite different. I was a hip-hop breakdancer, a karaoke star, and an underage drinker who could get into bars. The people at my parents' church, to them, I was the first baby born in our church plant, a stellar Bible verse memorizer, a star actor in the Christmas musicals, and the violin player in the church's worship team. I told you I had to do whatever I had to do in order to be accepted and get ahead. The only problem was when my worlds began to collide, and it was all because of a girl. I guess my mom was smarter than I put her out to be, because she started to notice the inconsistencies in my stories. I don't know if she ever checked the library where I was going to go and study, when in fact I was actually hooking up with my girlfriend. The fact is, when I got my report card, my grades weren't where they were supposed to be. My mom took matters into her own hands and told me that things were going to change. She began systematically shutting down all the opportunities that I had made to live out my alternate identities, and I just couldn't take it. So that's when I stormed out of the house, ran away with nowhere to go. I just started running. I didn't have my wallet, a plan, a phone. I just knew I had to get out of there. And by the time I arrived at the shopping mall in my hometown, I was furious, out of breath, and my mind was spinning, and I had no money. I was running away from something with absolutely nowhere to go. It was Friday night, and I had no idea where I was going to sleep. All I knew is that I wasn't going to go back home. I began asking random people in the mall for a quarter so that I could use the payphone. Once I looked pitiful enough to warrant a quarter from a random stranger, I tried to figure out who I was going to call. Well, it wasn't going to be my girlfriend because we were going through a rough spot, nor was it going to be my parents, obviously. I couldn't get in touch with my best friend, so the only number that I had memorized, the only other one, was my pastor's. Once I got in touch with him, told him what was going on, he calmly convinced me to take the bus to church because I had nowhere else to go. He said he would feed me and house me, so as a young 16-year-old, nothing could have sounded better. After another stranger gave me enough money for bus fare, I took the 90-minute bus ride to church and just participated in the church's Friday night activities like nothing was wrong. After we were finished, I got into the car with my pastor, and my expectation was that I was just going to crash on his couch. But I soon realized that if his couch was the destination, we were driving in the wrong direction. Over the next hour, while he was driving me home, he prayerfully listened as I began sharing, venting, confessing, and crying at all the same time. I don't remember quite what he said, nor do I remember what he said to my mom when we walked into my house together, but what I do remember is that he was present, he listened, and he gave me perspective, and he prayed for me. It's interesting how several years later, I found myself in the same situation again, only the roles were reversed. I was the youth pastor, being present, listening, giving perspective, and praying for a student that was going through a difficult time with his family. When's the last time you reflected on the way that you disciple others? Are you more of a teacher or a shepherd? Do you like to take people through formal curriculum, or do you use their life situation as the starting point? Do you like to disciple one-on-one and triads in small groups or in classrooms? When are people most apt to change? What role does the Holy Spirit and prayer play in the discipleship process? Now, unless you've intentionally spent time studying the way people learn and different methods for discipleship, you're probably discipling others the way you were discipled, or in the exact opposite manner. This is because our natural bias is to start with what we already know and have personally experienced. For example, if you're a parent, have you ever caught yourself saying something to your children that your parents used to say to you? Our natural bias is to teach the way that we've been taught and to lead the way that we've been led unless we make a conscious effort to change. In other words, until you re-examine the way you approach discipleship, you will naturally revert back to using the methods in which you were discipled, much like I did when I found myself in reverse roles as a youth pastor. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, since you may have been discipled by some of the best people. However, until you take a step back and realize why they did what they did, you will consistently hit a glass ceiling and have a hard time growing in the way that you disciple others. The point of this talk is to help you re-examine the way you approach discipleship so that you create ongoing transformational discipleship environments in your church plant, campus, or church. From one discipler to another, from one church leader to another, I want to help you grow in the way that you disciple, teach, and lead others towards Christ-likeness, as we see in Ephesians 4:13. So as I share these two principles, I want to encourage you to think about how you can begin applying them to your discipleship curriculum, Sunday school classes, spiritual formation seminars, and small groups. The first step is to embrace anxiety. Do you remember how anxious tests made you feel? What about the anxiety of getting back the grade from a test that you didn't study enough for? What about the time your grades weren't what you thought they should have been or what you needed them to be in order to get accepted into a particular college? Everyone in your church deals with anxiety in a different way. So understanding and reducing the different levels of anxiety in your discipleship environments is key. When you announce a discipleship class, a new small group, or ask if they would like to be discipled by you, what's the typical reaction at your church? Wouldn't you like to increase registration, attendance, and life transformation at every one of your discipleship opportunities? Well, there are 3 barriers that often prevent an individual from engaging in discipleship environments outside of the Sunday worship service. And then there's also a way to leverage them. But for the sake of time, let me just share the first 2 of them with you here today. Let's start with the knowledge barrier. The moment someone in your church hears about your discipleship opportunity and says, I won't learn anything from that, you are facing the knowledge barrier. This barrier is the easiest one to overcome because it boils down to basic marketing skills. According to a Yanklevich study quoted in the New York Times in 2007, the average person living in a city saw up to 5,000 ad messages a day. Imagine how much more that would be today. Regardless of where you live, the bottom line is everyone in your church is being consistently and constantly advertised to. So when you announce a discipleship opportunity to your church, guess who you're up against? The millions of dollars that professional marketing firms spend on marketing their films, the unlimited hours of content that you can find on Netflix, the dozens of emails that are filling up inboxes, and all the extra curricular activities that parents are driving their children around to. If the title or elevator speech of your discipleship opportunity can't compete against those other 5,000 messages, how do you expect to ever help the nominally engaged in your church grow deeper in their relationship with Christ? To overcome the knowledge barrier, try titling the name of your seminar or class differently. For example, instead of titling your next men's breakfast as the September 10 men's breakfast, try calling it something like Bacon, Biscuits, and Bravery. I guarantee you that title will cut through the noise and pique the curiosity of all the men in your church. There's more we can say about this one, but let's move to the next barrier. The next barrier is actually the hardest one to overcome because it deals with an individual's past. It's the relational hurt barrier. Everyone has experienced betrayal, your trust being broken, varying levels of conflict, both inside and outside the church. As a result, the extent to which an individual knows how to reconcile, forgive, and deal with their emotional baggage determines their likelihood to join a discipleship opportunity where they will need to open up to others, like a small group. To overcome this barrier, you need to help them create a new point of reference around community and transparency. For example, get your life groups together and get them to share their before and after stories of life change. And when you preach or teach, model transparency by sharing your own perfections and stories from your life like I did earlier. Let's now look at the second principle, move beyond your lectern. One of the easiest and safest things to do as a teacher is to prepare your lesson, teach it as a monologue, and then go home. This way you are in complete control and there are no variables to deal with. I remember one of my college professors was like this. He didn't like questions. So when anyone was brave enough to ask him one, he'd always react annoyed and respond with big words and complex theories. If you didn't agree with what he said or act like you understood, he would look at you like you're the stupidest person in the class. If it were not for tenure, he probably would have been fired. Unfortunately, since many of us teach the way we've been taught, this detrimental model of teaching continues to proliferate today, even in the church. Now, instead of being the sage on the stage, what would it look like if you were the guide on the side? This principle is core to this entire talk. Being the guide on the side is not just about letting people ask questions or interrupt your teaching, but it's a wholesale change of the way you look at the learning process. Aside from my horrific college professor example, in most classes, the teacher will often teach their lesson, nicely answer any questions, and then assign homework. In the same way, during a class on, let's say, serving and spiritual gifts, you will probably teach the class, answer any questions, and then talk about next steps. In this sage on the stage model of teaching, the teacher's the expert, the teacher has the knowledge, and the teacher or small group leader is passing their information on to the learner. Now, if you want to move from being the sage on the stage to being the guide on the side, you need to start seeing yourself less as the master teacher and more as the master facilitator. Instead of teaching a concept, what if you help learners discover it themselves? Instead of sharing your own examples, what if you had students share their examples with one another? Instead of being the only lecturer, what if you had your students take turns teaching the concepts that they needed to know? Being a guide on the side is about moving beyond your lectern and crafting a learning experience for everyone in the class. This means that your prep time will be spent less on crafting a lecture and more on crafting learning activities where students will move from discovery to application. Let me give you an example. Let's say you were teaching a class on serving and spiritual gifts. Now, instead of lecturing out of 1 Corinthians 12, Ephesians 4, and Romans 12, what if you divided your class into groups of, let's say, 5 or 6 people and gave each of them one of those passages? Each group would then be responsible to study that passage and craft a lesson on spiritual gifts, which they would then teach the rest of the class. After each group presented, you would have the other groups ask questions as if they were the teacher. When all the groups finished presenting, you would then go up to the front and facilitate a conversation where the class is sharing the learned insights that were consistent across all the presentations. Once that's done, then and only then would you add your thoughts on whatever was missed. Do you see the difference? If information transfer were the only goal, then it would be quicker and more efficient if you as the teacher prepared the lesson and lectured it, being the sage on the stage. However, if retention and transformation were the goal, then the latter method, being the guide on the side, would be far superior. After all, haven't you ever noticed that you learn and retain something the most when you yourself are the teacher? Now, if that's the case, why not allow the student to become the teacher and the teacher to become the guide? Now, during one small group, I wanted to teach on disciplining children. I spent quite a bit of time preparing because I wanted my group to grow in their ability to parent and discover different ways to discipline. However, instead of crafting a lecture, I crafted a learning experience. I was being the guide on the side. So I found 2 articles on the internet that each explained a different way to discipline. I printed them out and handed those articles to the group. The men got one and the women got the other, and then I split them up. I then asked each group to read through the article, discuss it, and come back to teach the rest of the group the concept that was outlined in the article, except I told them that they could not lecture. They actually had to role play the particular style of disciplining in a skit. Then to shake things up, I invited the children to participate and said that they were the judges and they got to determine which group won and who would get the best award for acting. I guarantee you that was one of the most memorable lessons and learning experiences that my group had, since they were all active learners, processing the material and then teaching it themselves, rather than being passive listeners sitting idly by while the lecturer dumps information. Being a guide on the side is not a time saver, since you still need to understand and grasp the concept that you are trying to teach. In fact, oftentimes it's more difficult to be a guide and not a sage, because it feels good to be the authority, the teacher, and the lecturer. But if this is what will lead to transformation and greater engagement, since students would be active learners instead of passive listeners, isn't it worth it? You cannot teach what you do not know, and you cannot lead where you will not go. In light of these two principles, what are you going to change? Where will you start? Perhaps it's the curriculum you provide for your small groups or Sunday school classes, or maybe it's your newcomers class or volunteer orientation. Take a moment and brainstorm the 1 or 2 places that you can integrate any one of these points this upcoming week, and then email me when you're done. I'd love to provide feedback. You can contact me on Twitter or email me directly at Daniel, SANGI, or Daniel@newchurches.com. Thanks.